Folks, good afternoon. Welcome to Cracking the Comms Code. This is Dustin Siggins with Proven Media Solutions. And with me today are three experts in corporate communications and especially making sure executives do the right thing and grow the brand, don't cause a crisis for it, and especially don't crash and burn a brand, uh, which is the opposite of what their job is supposed to be. So with Lainie, Alex, and Erin come from very different backgrounds, but all with decades of experience in the corporate space. And so I'll throw it to Lainie, Alex, and Erin in that order. Everyone introduce themselves, and then please bring your questions to the comments as we kick off our conversation.
Well, hi. Thanks for having me, Dustin. I'm excited to chat today. I'm Lainie Keller, 20 plus year veteran in communications, corporate communications, largely in the pharmaceutical industry, working for companies like Merck, Novartis, Bausch Health, and Bausch Lomb. And one thing that I often see in working with executives is that I often see when an issue comes up, I see one of two things happen, sort of very one of two immediate things. Either there's like a desire to jump in immediately and say something and come up with some reason why they need to speak, or they're afraid to say anything at all, even in those really critical times. So I think that's something that'll be interesting for us to chat about today a little bit.
Thanks, Lainie. My name's Alex Dudley. I work currently with Cognizant, which is an IT services firm, global in nature with more than 350,000 employees across the globe. But I have a 30-year career in communications, working for all types of executives, including the ones that Lainie just described, those who can't wait to say something, anything, and those who would never say anything if they had their druthers. Each provides their unique challenges, and I think that what you'll probably hear from all of us today is that there's not one single formula that works, but it's finding the formula that works for your company and your executive that really offers the most dividends.
Thank you, Dustin, and I'm happy to be joined with Lainie and Alex today. I'm Erin Weinstein. I'm a managing director and co-chair of the healthcare practice at SKDK, a public affairs and PR firm located in Washington, D.C. I have 25 years experience working both in the private sector as well as in the public sector, working in government, overseeing communications, public affairs, and public affairs work. Similar to Alex and Lainie, done a lot of work with executives, CEOs, the C-suite, especially in times of crisis. And so, I think one of the big takeaways, similar to what Lainie and Alex have said, like being able to, counsel folks on what the best response is in those situations, but also not maybe necessarily what the best response, but one that is obviously authentic to the organization, the company, to their customers, their stakeholders, and others is a really like important piece and factor to be thinking about when you're counseling CEOs and executives. So looking forward to jumping in and having a dialogue and talking more about some of these various issues.
One of the things we talked about in our prep call is how I think Lainie was the one who said it, but everyone agreed that nothing remains private anymore. Nothing remains internal. We're seeing that at CVS right now, as Alex pointed out. So, Lainie, I'd like you to kind of lay out here how important internal comms is, especially given that anything is going to leak at any time. How executive communications leaders need to guide the C-suite first for internal comms before focusing on external comms.
Well, whenever there's an issue or anything, hits the fan, ideally you want to be telling your employees first. Now, that can't always happen. Sometimes it needs to happen concurrently. For example, if something is material to the company's stock or, when things happen, sometimes you can't necessarily go to employees first. But in an ideal world, you want to do that. You want to make sure your employees are aware, understand how whatever the decision is or whatever it is that you're communicating fits in with your mission. And recognizing importantly, like I think we said in the earlier call, that anything that you say to your employees, you just have to assume is public as well. So of course you want to be authentic, say to them what you really feel, how you feel, and that's how you should also be communicating externally. But ideally, you want to get to your employees first if you can.
Now, why, Alex, and from a crisis perspective, why is that so important? And going internal first when going internal might lead to a delay in going external. Why is it
Well,
so important that employees know first?
two things on that. One, I'm not always convinced that any delay is bad. I think there are a lot of examples when speed kills. And so I think that taking a beat to communicate with your employees is probably good on a number of different fronts. But, they have such a window into the company culture that they're your barometer for whether it resonates or not, right? Like if it, Erin mentioned authenticity right off the bat, and it's a huge one. And I'd love her thoughts on this, but like your employees know when what you're saying doesn't jive with what you're doing because they see what you're doing. So I think that if you want to test out your authenticity, you've got no greater critics than your employees because they see through it all. So, but I'd love Erin's perspective on that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's not just your employees, but looking at the external piece of this, it's your customers, it's your stakeholders, it's others. I mean, in this environment that we live in where information travels so quickly and the things that you say are recorded and live forever. Things that you have said in the past, like that don't necessarily jive with what you're saying in the heat of a crisis, like they come back to haunt you. And it obviously hurts as you're thinking about being authentic and true to who you are. I mean, that's a very again, that could really upend like the message that you're trying to send. But look, I mean, your employees, we counsel CEOs and executives on this all the time. Your employees in many cases are your biggest ambassadors for you, for the company, for your customer. Like they are like your heart and soul. And if they don't believe what you're saying, it's going to be really hard to convince people who don't, who are not part of you or part of what you're doing day in and day out.
One of the things that you said that was interesting there, Erin, is about the different audiences. And I think one of the trickiest early action items in crisis is trying to determine which audiences are actually impacted by the crisis in which you find yourself. Because, just like I think a lot of people automatically assume, okay, we're in crisis, we better talk to customers. When maybe your crisis actually, you might be better off speaking to employees or investors or regulators. So I think that brings up an interesting point that sometimes the best thing to do is first establish which stakeholders are impacted by the crisis before you do anything, and then figure out how to communicate with those.
Well, I would say which ones are impacted, and then also sort of mapping, like, again, like, okay, so maybe you have three various audiences that are impacted, but which one is going to have the biggest, like, impact on the business or on if it's a regulation or on future business, whatever it may be. I mean, I think you also have to evaluate like which of those like audiences perhaps like you need to communicate with first, or what is like you may have to slightly tailor messaging to, although you should be saying the same thing essentially to everyone. But you may have to tailor things a little bit to some of those various audiences, depending on, again, the nature of the situation or what you can say publicly for legal reasons, whatever it may be. But I think that, we counsel folks like in terms of when you're thinking of crisis planning, like, how do you not just plan, but like, how are you looking at like your various audiences and like what they need to hear, who they need to hear it from, who's going to reach out to them. I think a big part of, I mean, this is probably a separate conversation, but like crisis planning is the planning piece, right? So when these things do happen, the first thing, like, this isn't the first like time you're dealing with the crisis plan or seeing it or taking it off the shelf, but like you really understand who your audiences are, what you need to do, who you should be getting in touch with, who should be at that table, like who are those executive leaders that are in the room, who are talking to the folks, counseling them. And look, in many cases, like it should be communicators and others that are going to obviously be decision makers too.
Right. And I would just add in, because it's funny, you literally jumped into sort of crisis and scenario planning, and I was thinking that as well. And within that scope, as you're planning for different scenarios, different crises and different scenarios, different audiences are top. I mean, I like to think of it as like in any situation, right? Your core audience who you have to make sure is aligned with you, your, critical, who are the ones that you really have to manage, and then those contextual audiences that maybe you just need to kind of monitor, make sure everything's, but in that order. And that changes based on whatever the different situation or scenario is that happens. Who falls into which bucket. So
Yeah.
Yeah, when you hear it from folks who have spent their careers in regulated industries, you know it's the real deal because that adds a layer of complexity that less regulated or lightly regulated businesses just don't have to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Well, and when it comes to making sure that executives are positioned right, whether it's during crisis, right before, or a year before, and you're the communications person trying to make sure that doesn't become a crisis. One of the things that kind of you see in the media a lot or on social media is these sort of more bombastic, more aggressive. Those CEOs, these are people who get the attention. But I was doing an email thread with a number of other folks who, like you all, have a lot of experience in corporate comms, and they said the biggest challenge they've had is actually getting an executive to not be so shy, not be so withdrawn, to actually speak up more than they are comfortable doing. So how do you work with the CEO? And what's your strategy sort of philosophically to ensure that you're meeting the CEO where they are and nudging them where they need to go, whether it's the message, they are the messenger, or maybe they prefer to do live interviews, but they're more shy, so they should do something that's maybe pre-recorded. How do you work with CEOs strategically?
Yeah, I mean, I think establishing a relationship with the CEO is critical. And so, when you've got some comfort, and when you have been, I mean, more importantly, having been right in the past is a huge help, right? But when in doubt, call a consultant and have them say it too, because a lot of times, like outside perspective, weight carries more. It's ridiculous, but true. I'm sure, Erin, you're
I
laughing,
was
but
gonna say,
I'm sure you
like,
see it all the time.
I tell, like, well, I mean, I tell, like, we talk about this internally here at the firm, and I say, like, yeah, I mean, a lot of CEOs hire us to tell them what they don't want to hear. And a big part of that, and when they recognize that, that they need somebody to be honest with them. And that is I think, to me, like, a big part of our business and like how we have built trust is being, is honesty and being brutally honest. Like, people don't hire outside counselors or chief communications officers or whoever it is at this level to like tell them. I mean, there are some, but like to tell them what they want to hear. Like, they tell that they want the brutal, honest truth in some cases. And not to to step on your answer here, interrupt, but look, I think the other piece to that is, as you're thinking, counseling executives is, I think it's really important, yes, to build trust. And then two, if they are like, I mean, we've dealt with plenty of them, and especially I feel like in the last few years, who don't want to be out there, who may be more shy, who don't, is reminding them, like, you are the CEO. Like, people do want to hear from you. Now, I think there's a balance there. Like, the CEO shouldn't be the face of everything, especially if you're looking at like a large company with, various business units or whatever it may be. But when there are big issues on the line, or right, like there's a crisis, or depending on what it is, like there is an audience a lot of times and there is a moment where it needs to be the CEO. And that is like sometimes the brutal, honest truth that like you got to convey to people. If it's I can think of last year, we were prepping a CEO who was called in front of Congress for a congressional hearing, an oversight hearing on something, and she really did not want to be the one. And she was like, well, what about this person? And I was like, no, it needs to be you. Like, you are the buck stops with you. Like, you are the CEO. And sometimes, right, you sadly have to be the one that has to deliver that brutal truth. But that's the job.
No, so what you said about hiring outside counsel, I think there's been at least 3 times in the last year. And I've never been told this by a client until the last year to year and a half. I think we've had 3 different clients bring us in for projects specifically so they can then tell their client, see, what I've been telling you is correct. This is not going to work. We need to do something different. I was kind of happy to be paid to just be the bad cop. That's totally fine with me. But I was surprised to hear how common that seems to be.
When I hire a consultant, one of the things that I tell them is, look, we have our biases, we have ways that we do things, and that can be wonderful, but it's a huge blind spot. So
Yep.
just, like your job is to keep us honest, right? Your job is to not think, like I often tell my team that the only unacceptable answer to a question is because that's the way we've always done it. And
Yes.
and I think that, but there's some of that in every organization, and the outside perspective is wonderful for just helping keep you honest, and open your eyes to the blind spots that you carry day to day, and that's exactly what Erin was just describing, and that's why it's a critical component of it.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. Just being able to have that outside perspective, get it from, from somewhere else. Because to your point, Alex, we do, as much as we like to think, and I like to think I'm a little bit more, open than maybe someone who's in a very specific business unit within a company or something, but we still do have that biases. We still do think and what we know. And maybe what we know more of internally and, why someone might be motivated one way, whereas someone from the outside can be like, hold on, let's take a look at this because this just, you're just a little too close to it, So I think I couldn't agree more, that, and having been on the inside really more for the past 20 years, when I was in PR agencies for my first 10, that the most valuable agencies and consultants that I've worked with are the ones that will just tell me straight up the truth and say, okay, let's work on this together, but you're wrong, or here's what you haven't thought about, and let's look at that together before we go talk to the CEO or to the executive together.
Yeah,
One of
just
the
one
things,
more note
excuse
on
me, Alex.
how to gain trust with an executive. I think, we kicked this around a little bit in the lead up meeting, but you have to know the business. Like it is not enough to be really great at PR, to be a senior communications executive. You have to know your business. You have to know the balance sheet. Everybody else around that table that we keep asking for a seat at knows the balance sheet. Everybody knows how the business works, where the money is, how the money is made, what levers to pull to increase revenue, to decrease capex. You need to be reading 10Ks and 10Qs, and you got to read the earnings release that I know 75% of you say, yeah, this looks good to me, without reading past the quote. You got to dig in on that stuff. Otherwise, you're just a comms person, which is frankly, one of the things that we as communications executives complain about. It's a bit pejorative, and that a lot of that is self-inflicted. So I think the other thing that you need to do is be a business person first, with a focus on communications, rather than be a communicator who happens to work for a business.
I think that's
Well said.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's a really key element too of building trust with the CEO and the C-suite, is really understanding their business. Because I think if you understand their business, then you can see around those corners and know from a communications perspective, what are the things, like what are the watch outs? What are the things that we need to prepare for? What are the things that could have a real impact on our business that you can counsel, leadership about, and make a plan, or have a holding statement or whatever it is. I really think your point is very well made, in the sense that, like, really understanding the business and the ins and outs of the business is a really key piece of, like, being an effective communicator or consultant for a company.
Well, the funny part of it is I've yet to meet a CFO who didn't feel like they could weigh in on communications policy. So why shouldn't a communicator feel free, if they have the right business acumen, to weigh in on something financial? It's
Yeah.
just preposterous. I say a lot that everybody with a mouth thinks they're a communicator, which is obviously wrong. But I think everybody should also think of themselves as a finance person or a business person. I mean, that's got to be a big percentage of what you do and think about.
You have to, and not just finance. I would say you also need to understand operations. You need to understand how commercial is working.
Yep.
And you mentioned, like, pulling the levers earlier, right? And because that helps you as the communicator to then understand when is the right time, when you really need to push on, okay, this is an issue that we need to address, or this is an issue that we need to be prepared for, but maybe it's not something we're proactive on. And here's why, because here's how it would or wouldn't impact the long-term health of the business of the company.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a more powerful statement than, I think we should do this because otherwise it'll be in the media and that's bad. Like, you know, that's such better advice, right? Like, it's
Right.
just in a different league.
Right.
Mhm.
I have a piece that I'm pitching right now. I think it's going to get published in the next 2 weeks. But the thesis is speaking C-suite. This is a phrase I say a lot on LinkedIn, but speaking C-suite is the new core comms competency. And then I led with how it took me 3 years to understand that. I launched my company in 2018. I kept saying to prospects, because in the political space, and Erin knows this as well as I do, if you say we're going to get you in the press, everyone's celebrating, especially
Mhm.
back then. If you go to the business space, which I did, and say to people, say to CEOs of companies that are 500,000 to 5 million or even 20 million, we're going to get you in the press. And their first response wasn't yay, as I had previously experienced as a freelancer and in the trade association space. It was, why? I said, well, we're going to get you in the press. And they said, great. Isn't PR just marketing? It was the most frustrating thing. And it took me 3 years to realize that I was the problem. Because if
Mhm.
I didn't have a business reason for them to get into the media, they can just send ads out on LinkedIn or they can go to networking events or doing any number of other things. And so now, probably 20% of the time, we tell prospects PR is not the right fit for you. It doesn't make business sense because you're not prepared for it. You don't have the budget. Your marketing team isn't in place. We're just going to be air cover. And air cover is useless in the military if you're trying to actually take and hold the island.
Mhm.
And so we often say no, or tell somebody you need to change your strategy before you're ready for us. But it took me forever to figure that out, to your point. So let's take a pivot into public affairs. We've kind of hinted around it a little bit here. Erin, you work with, I think, primarily your work, SKDK is openly a progressive firm. We have a lot of center right and conservative clients. But one thing that I think that unites all of our business clients is sort of a fear of offending, let's say, I don't know, pick a random example, a president who might have, I don't know, Truth Social,
Mhm.
or the employees who are going to leak something in a way that puts the company in front of the National Labor Relations Board, in front of Congress, getting Bernie Sanders, who is now calling for AI employees to reach out to him, and because he's the ranking member of an important committee. How do Alex, you talked earlier about how speed kill, but you also have to be ready to move quickly in today's political era. So, Aaron, I'd be very interested in how you're guiding CEOs and the C-suite to look around the political corners as government affairs and comms, corporate comms really become more closely united.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think in the last, year and a half, 2 years, like there's been a lot of our work has focused on that. I mean, yes, I sit in DC and I do work for a firm that is, democratic and at its core. And so, yeah, like how we are spending a lot of time and have been asked by clients, like how, not everyone, but right, like how do we protect ourselves against, right, the tweet that could blow up our business or take us away from our day-to-day operations or, obviously sparks an inquiry or oversight. And so a lot of what we have been spending time doing is counseling folks and doing the preparation, right? So how are we, again, as a trusted advisor with a seat at the table, like being the ones that are, helping pull together, like what are the strategies? What are, sort of what's the game plan if some of this happens? Like, look, I think a big part of this is, as I said from the get-go, is like having a seat at the table, like being at that, table to start to do these plannings, to do this planning, to be thinking about what are the things that could come up, mapping out the various scenarios. But a big part of it too, we touched a little bit on this earlier, is, really understanding the business. And when there is like a tweet that's out there that is just something you maybe want to ignore and being able to make that call, or if it's something that is going to have a real direct impact on your business. It could be calling for an oversight hearing or, a criminal investigation or whatever that is, and sort of understanding like what those levels are and like when do you respond? Do you respond? Do you just let it go? Like, again, I think it's a combination of understanding your audience, mapping out like how you would respond, doing some planning and some scenario planning, and then being able to like quickly mobilize if you do need to respond with a response that makes the most sense for you, your company, your business, that won't maybe add on to that. I mean, we do a lot of work as well in like with some highly regulated industries. So like responding quickly, yes, in some cases is important, but could have some really big impacts on like the business and on regulation and all of that. So that's at times like where speed maybe isn't the most important. Look, I think some of the best and biggest counsel we've had, like for clients in this environment, has been like the importance of planning and really like taking a deep dive into your business and understanding where you may have some vulnerabilities and like how do we look at those, message against those, maybe put some safeguards in place. And then also like where are there opportunities in this time to, we shouldn't all be putting our heads in the sand. I mean, I think that's a lot of what I've heard too is like, I want to lay low. I don't want to say anything for like the next 2 to 4 years. And that's not a way to do business either. So how are we being strategic about telling our stories, getting our voice out there, being a leader in our industry where it makes sense? Because I think that's another place where we've seen a lot of pullback is like people don't necessarily want to be out front or be the leader, even knowing they are, because they don't want to draw attention or they don't want to be in the line of fire. And they think that by being out there and maybe speaking or being in the media more, or doing big marketing campaigns or big publicity like around the stuff is just going to make them a target. And so I think it's really, again, being able to know if you understanding the business, knowing the business, so you can give strategic, strong counsel on how to move forward and not being scared to, talk about your business and what you do.
No, Lainie, I was just rechecking your background a little bit while Erin was talking. You've been in a very regulated industry your entire, most of your
Most of my
career,
career.
healthcare, but you've been in companies like Merck, which are, the political environment can be everything from a politician disliking you, going back to the Bernie Sanders example or whatever, all the way to something actually goes wrong and the FDA pulls something and now, or you get called in front of Congress. I remember the Toyota braking issue. I was a newbie in DC. What a coincidence that the same government that owns two of the competitors to Toyota calls the CEO of Toyota in front of Congress over the braking issue. Toyota had 5 million cars on the road or whatever the number was in the US alone, but 600 braking issues got the CEO called in front. When you're working in healthcare, how politically aware does the communications team need to be and how closely do they have to work with the government affairs team in order to properly guide the C-suite?
So in healthcare, right? In particularly in pharmaceuticals and med devices, things like that, you have to be in lockstep. And what I've seen actually in a lot of the companies I've been at is this increase of not just working in tandem, but corporate affairs includes both communications and government affairs under one remit. And
Oh,
it's working very, very closely and literally having like a bat phone to call to have your connection down in DC to make sure, okay, I'm about to say this. Is there anything that's happened in the last 15 minutes that's going to even cause an issue? Or, working with your government affairs teams to think about before we say something, is this going to conflict with something we've said in the past? Or could this cause an issue down the line? What's bubbling inside the Beltway that if we make a comment about now could come back to bite us in 10 months or not. And and that's the same thing with the business aspect too, right? You want to make sure that anything you're saying is not going to hurt you in 3 quarters from a financial standpoint. But absolutely, I think the importance of working with the government affairs space and the communication space, you've got to be in lockstep partners together. If you're not even combined, which like I said, I've seen it in 3 of the last companies I've been at, they've been combined together under one roof.
and Alex, you talked about speed can kill. Again, there's so many of these controversies politically. And again, I come from a political background, so I used to do lots of hot takes. I've gone back and read some of the pieces earlier in my career, and I now know what my father meant when he said I was a 24-year-old writing like a 24-year-old, taking everything way too seriously as important. And you see it, last year, right, when the Kiss Cam, this is not a political thing, but Kiss Cam, the CEO and the head of HR, and most people talk about like it was a crisis for the company, when in reality, I think it was mostly a crisis for those two executives and their families. But at the same time, the company was quiet and everyone thought it was a bad idea, but I think they were quite smart to keep their head down. People were going to say stuff whenever they wanted to, and they came out with the Gwyneth Paltrow ad, which I think reversed a lot of the negative attention. So when it comes to the political space, you work at a large corporation currently. Are you looking at politics as a major risk factor for your organization?
Well, I think if you don't, you're foolish, right? I mean, the one thing that keeps every CEO up at night is fear of government overtake, right? Period. Like, end of discussion. I mean, I think as an American, you should always be wary of government. I too worked in government, and it's not a conspiracy theory. It's just the way democracy works. And I think the short answer is yes. I think to the larger question, I think more often than people realize, the most strategic thing that you can do is nothing. And I think people really forget that sometimes doing nothing can be a strategic tactical option. And, there's a bunch of type A people in communications, and I'm one of them. And it's really hard to tell people whose entire self-worth is based around doing stuff to not do anything. So it's really tough advice to give, sometimes really tough advice to follow, but it's really right more often than you think. I mean, just going back to the political example, 2 years ago, it was like Washington felt like chaos, right? There was all these new tactics that the administration was using to seemingly regulate without congressional approval, or weaponize certain departments of the government, et cetera, whatever negative connotation you want to say, but it felt like chaos. Now, 2 years later, or a year and 3/4 later, it kind of feels like, all right, we've kind of got our arms around what they are doing and how they do it, and it doesn't feel. It may not be right. I'm not suggesting it is, but it doesn't feel as chaotic just because you're used to it. It's just a factor of time, and over time heals all wounds. Like, over time, you can get comfortable with almost anything. Again, it doesn't mean it's right or that you should, but just like sometimes your reaction in the moment is not what your reaction would be if you had all the facts or a little bit of time to think about it or process it. And I think, one of the first things that people say about crisis is speed. And I just think that that's not the way I like to think about it, because I always worry about, I rarely do I worry about going too slow in crisis. I very often worry about going too fast, because mistakes get made. You haven't thought things through. I am also the kind of person who likes to think about something, particularly a big decision. I really like to sleep on it if I can. And I grew up, my dad was in politics, and his advice to me was never make a decision until you absolutely have to. And I kind of live by that advice in many cases. So associating crisis with speed for me is just, it doesn't allow me to do my most strategic work. And I think it often prompts others in the same way.
So let's take a pivot here. We talked in our prep call that a lot of executive crises are more mundane, right? They're not the ones that necessarily get tweeted, but you had, what was the company that just let was it board chair go for reasons undisclosed? And it was the second time they'd had to let a board chair or a CEO go in the last 12 months. He was brought in to be a stabilizing force. I forget which company it was in the last 10 days. But a lot of times, when we had this show last year with a couple of crisis and executive communications folks, they pointed out that a lot of the crises are scandals of the fraud type. The executive leaves the company, or two executives leave the company, leaving gaping holes in the communication strategy. So I'd like to talk about some of the more mundane matters that you simply have to be able to be ready for and coach people forward as a communications executive. So Lainie, you talked about swim lanes earlier. As I mentioned, we're doing an executive rollout for a company that has an entirely new leadership in the last 12 months, and they haven't rolled them out yet. So they hired us to roll them out through op-eds and interviews, and each one of them has a different swim lane. Each one of them is, and we're going to work very hard that they don't cross over to ensure that they're reaching the audience that most trusts that specific executive. So can you talk a bit about swim lanes there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to your point. If an executive leaves and they are the one voice of the company, then the company's lost its voice. It's got nobody. So
Right.
you need to have more than one. And second of all, no one can be an expert in everything, right? You need
Mhm.
so let your R&D be the head expert in the R&D or in the science. Let your, head of supply chain be the expert in, how to navigate operations and around the world, and get your product to where it needs to be around the world. Um, and so in having those different swim lanes that they are more focused on, it does a few things. One, it enables you to kind of spread and build your bench a little bit more strongly. And two, it also takes the pressure off that one person, right? If the CEO is the only person ever answering questions, or one particular person, then there is more apt of if they have a mistake, then it's bigger than if you have three or four different people or five or six people on your bench that can all speak to different topics, and one makes a mistake, the others can kind of pick up and help smooth over and transition, or explain if it's not a mistake, why they felt strongly about how they did and how it helps the company and the business of the company overall. But I truly believe that it's so important that you really have multiple people who can be spokespersons, who can be out there speaking, and that they may each have different personal, not beliefs that are different, but personal things that they're passionate about and that they can speak to, personally as their personal passion.
Erin, along those same lines, how many on the public affairs side, how many sort of crises do you see that don't make the headlines, or potential crises, or areas where you talked about on the prep call, your team is helping a major figure in the healthcare space or a major company
Hmm.
transition from a CEO who's been there since the last century.
Yeah.
And so, how are you helping them navigate this transition to where you're leading the executive out the right way, but also leading the new executive in, while also making sure the rest of the executive team is aligned?
Yeah. I mean, I think to your point, well, to your first question, I mean, there have been plenty of times companies or clients have engaged with us and been like, "Oh my God, there's gonna be a huge crisis. Like we have all this stuff." And I've said this a couple times. I think preparation and really sort of mapping out all the scenarios that could happen is key to avoid like
Mhm.
a lot of those things happening. And I can think of, tons of times where what we all thought would be a crisis like has blown over or it hasn't reached the paper, and that is a huge success, right? Like that, I
Right.
mean, maybe not the most exciting and satisfying like from a case study perspective, but it is actually like great and the best outcome you can achieve, and I think clients are tend to be very happy with that. But yeah, I mean, we have been brought in over the years on several engagements where, you have a leader who, or a CEO who is transitioning out of the organization. As you mentioned, recently we've worked with a client that has been the CEO of the organization for, over 3 decades, and, has built the organization from nothing into what a, real thriving sort of organization in the healthcare space and the health policy space. And the idea of change and is exciting to some extent, but right, like that leader is going to still be in place through the end of this year and has a lot of guidance and things and that he wants to finish out strong. But right, like how are we also positioning the organization for the future and what does the future look like? And a lot of that will be the same, right? Because the organization's not going to fundamentally change. And I don't think people expect or want that. But with any leadership transition, I mean, there is change, right? It's a different person. It's sometimes different viewpoints. It's different decision making. Um, but a lot of that, in a lot of the work that we do is like, even before this announcement is made, is who are the people we need to communicate with? What do we need to be telling them to give them that sometimes the reassurances or have them understand why this change is happening, make them comfortable with that change. I mean, we all know like a lot of people hate change, like they don't see excitement and opportunity in it. So how are we making sure that when we are communicating change, we are communicating the benefits, the opportunities, the growth, whatever it might be? And again, this is where really understanding like the organization, the business, the leadership, how they run, and being able to counsel and advise to what is going to make sense for any given organization and their like, who they are, what their ethos is really important. Because if from an outside perspective, coming in and being like, hey, this is what you should do, and it doesn't align or jive with where the organization is or where they want to be going, like is just not going to be solid strategic counsel and is only going to create more problems. So I think that, it's really a big thing. Sometimes we're brought in like right as like they're about to like fire a CEO or change, leadership. And so I think like even sometimes in those examples, like, and in those cases, like again, really just understanding what the assignment is, what the company is, and what they're trying to achieve and who they are are all really important factors.
Alex, being in the AI space, there's always lots of actual and potential controversies. I remember, this is not AI, but I'll make a transition. When the new Starbucks CEO was brought in, there was all these headlines. Seemed like every 4 to 10 days that he was in violation of company return to office policies because he was jet setting everywhere. Despite the headlines, it seems like the company's doing pretty well, and it seems like investors are very happy, and other changes have been made strategically internally. I think you guys just announced what, 20,000 college graduates are being offered jobs at the company. And a lot of AI firms are sort of in these odd positions of trying to grow the company while also trying to say, there's a future, we promise. We don't know exactly what that future is. How are AI companies, in your opinion, their AI CEOs? I mean, they're trying to have this strange balance of optimism while also being realistic. Do you think they're overthinking that to a degree, or do you think that is where they need to be in the moment?
Well, I mean, we're in the IT consulting and services business, so I think our view is that it's easy to spend a lot of money on AI, right? But what you get is technology. That doesn't make it work. So we help you turn that kind of promise into, I mean, like anybody can download Claude, but can you make it actually helpful for you? And that's what we do. So
Oh,
I
I'm
think
sorry,
the
I didn't
short
realize
answer
that.
is no. I think we firmly believe that we have a healthy business today and going forward. I think the numbers bear that out too right now, which has really been beneficial. We've reported strong growth in the past 2 quarters at least. I've only been there 2 quarters, so I'm sure we had before that. But anyway, so I think the truth is that again, this goes back to the same thing with like the administration, right? Like
Right.
everything, if you believe everything that everybody says, you would never, I would never get out of bed in the morning, right? I
Right.
would hide under my covers and just wait to die. But the truth is somewhere between the doomsayers and the glorious optimists, right? Like, no, life is not always unicorns and rainbows, but it's also not all doom and gloom. So, in most things and most times, I find that the truth is somewhere in the middle. And certainly from our perspective, we have a business. Like I am learning so much. I've been in this business 30 years, right? Like when I started, I cut articles out of the newspaper and taped them to a piece of paper, and I took them to a fax machine and I copied them and I put them all together and I stapled it, and then I walked it around the office and left it in all the executives' desks. Now I have someone that works for me who isn't even human, and it's amazing, and I'm learning all kinds of stuff, and I'm learning how to use it and where it's great and how it works for me,
Right.
and how it helps me be more productive. And so I think that a lot of it comes from a little bit of like self-concern, about the future, anxiety about the future. Of course, that's natural. But I think the truth is that it'll probably be fine.
Well, and that goes back to your point about speed, something's being a killer, or to Erin's point about not overreacting. I saw someone on LinkedIn who I respect a great deal said that if the people who are overpromising on AI jobs, the future of AI and jobs, if they're wrong, everyone's going to remember it. I just don't think people have that kind of long-term memory. COVID was only 6 years ago, and a lot of people seem to have kind of forgotten about aspects of it, whether the political aspects or the job aspects. That's like it didn't exist for a lot of people. So I do think we have a lot of
I mean,
tools.
look, I think people are goldfish, right? They have 2 second
Yeah.
memories, right? I mean, that's why if you want to create great content, it better be about 8 seconds long.
Right.
And
Or it can be long content, but you have to get their memory again every 8 seconds.
indeed, indeed. I mean, there was a big controversy about a film that came out I don't know, big controversy might be strong, but a film that came out on Netflix, and I think it was Matt Damon and Ben Affleck were talking about how you have to create films these days, given the shift in folks' attention span. Like adapting to the world around you is just a fact of life. People have been always doing it, and it's it's always been an adapter or get left behind kind of existence. So this is the next thing. I think it's big, and I think it's amazing. Like I'm actually enjoying it. And this at first, I was as nervous as others, but the nice thing about going to an IT services company is that they demand that we kind of understand it and use it and incorporate it into the business. So that's helped me figure out how to get over my fear because now I've fully embraced it.
So I want to got about 5 to 10 minutes left. So Erin, I'd like to ask you a interesting question. You've worked with executives who are in government and executives in business. Do you see what differences do you see in the way you have to guide people who are an executive in a government agency versus in the private sector? Are there major differences that the rest of us might be unaware of in the style?
I would say, I mean, no, I would say largely, you're if you're I've worked for a cabinet secretary, and although her stakeholders may be different, than, than a business, like she actually came from a business background. So, and
Oh,
I say a lot of the things are a lot of the things I guide and counsel CEOs on are exactly the same as I would guide a cabinet secretary. I mean, look, when you're a cabinet secretary, or even I work for a member of Congress too, yeah, you're in the public eye, perhaps more than you are when you're a CEO of a company, depending on the company. But I would say largely it's the same. I mean, a lot of it is the same. Again, I would say there's some specific elements, when you're a cabinet head or member of Congress and you're spending people's tax dollars, like there are some other like considerations you have to think about from a messaging perspective. Um, some of those things have gone out the window, but in recent years. But look, I think there's also a lot of the same things if you think about optics and again, strategic counsel and what they should be saying when, and that all eyes are on you sometimes. Like a lot of those things I would say, are largely the same. I will say, and we talked about this at the beginning, similarly, like internal audiences, like especially in government, are, I think, very critical. I mean, having worked in the Department of Commerce, a lot of our internal like audiences, or in some cases people would say customers, like making sure they understood some of the decisions that were happening like in the secretary's office or coming from some of the different within the different bureaus was really important. Or
sure.
communicating, policy changes, or if there was an executive order that was coming down from the White House, like making sure that like people within the agencies understood like what that was going to mean for like the day to day was almost more important
That's a
than
good point.
the public, like what the public
Mhm.
like was going to take away from it. Because it would have like it had real implications on people's day-to-day work. So if that was, I would say that is probably was a much bigger element to some of the work than the external. Again, depending on what the announcement was or what was happening. But if you think about just like policy changes or
Mhm.
understanding, how, especially a big bureau, especially a big agency like Commerce, understanding sometimes like what policy changes or again, executive orders like could mean for people's day to day was really important to communicate.
And I'll sort of jump in and say, I think having been in more of a regulated industry, we actually saw a lot of that internally as well, even within business, right? As policy changes happen, working in pharma, for example, so much of what we do is governed by the FDA. So if something changes within the FDA, we need to make sure that the employees understand quickly what we need to do, and get, perspective from pharma, which is our industry organization, or and also speak with our peers and understand what how everyone is interacting and trying to assess and determine what it really means. So I actually think that you see that, at least I've seen a good bit of that, to Erin's point about making sure that you understand when policy changes happen internally, even within business as well.
That's a good point. We've been doing a lot of healthcare work on some FDA stuff. And yeah, I mean, I can see how if the drug gets stopped by the FDA or gets approved and then unapproved, how that could impact internal audiences for like layoffs, or we promised you jobs and now we have to pull them.
Yeah,
Or
or even how you market something, or to your point, the sales team or whatever. There's so many different nuances that really can, and you want to make sure you're doing things appropriately and rightly, and for the patient. And from the pharma experience, what we always say is we want to put the patients first and do what's right for the patients, but you also have to do it within the scope of what's governed, and make sure that you're doing things properly within how it's governed, or what the rules and regulations are, so that you can then work to get the medicines to the patients or do whatever you're doing.
Yeah, or being able to communicate. I mean, I know, like, because I do a lot of work in the pharma world too. Like, when drugs are going through clinical trial, like understanding like that's not necessarily approval, or how people, obviously, especially in certain areas, in certain therapeutic areas, like people read things and they think sometimes they take it as read things that the company puts out, and they think that, oh my gosh, like I can get this is what this is going to mean. And being able to like clearly communicate that from leadership or from the company is really important. So you're not giving people false hope or giving people false information.
Well, I want to close on something that I admittedly have a self-interest in, which is sometimes it's best for the spokesperson to not have the letter C next to their name. Right? A huge part of our business model in public affairs is company X needs to change policy at the FDA or impact Congress or impact state lawmakers. And so we are asked by our clients, typically the public affairs agency, to find a third-party author who lives in the state or is an expert in the industry who can say their client's narrative without the client even having to say it and never even knowing it existed until after it gets published or after the interview happens. And so one thing that I think is really interesting is, as we all said at the beginning, is that employees can be your most important ambassador. And so I'd be interested in having them kind of do a quick round table. What's the phrase? You go really quickly.
Round robin.
Horn.
I was like, wait, Robin Hood? No, that's an app. But okay. So around Robin on when maybe a specific scenario or case study where you advise the C-suite that actually this is best for somebody who is a customer or an employee to take over the narrative. And again, we do this a lot in the public affairs space. We also did it last year for a conference where, yeah, we got a couple of people inside the organization, but we also got voices who were attending the conference to speak out more because they were more credible than someone saying, hey, it's going to be a great conference. Who's, well, gosh, you're the organizer. Of course you're going to say that.
I mean, the entire profession of public relations is that, right? I mean, using third-party validators is, I mean, that's what we do like all day long. And if it's a customer, awesome. If it's an uninterested party or unaffected party, even better. And if it's, and it works for good and bad, right? If the president of the United States is saying that you're the greatest thing since sliced bread, that's good. If they're saying you should fire your CEO, that's bad. But in the end, that's what we do, is try and find ways to validate the messaging through parties and impact the perception of our brands, clients, products, etc. by doing so.
Yeah.
I guess I'm looking at when you guide the CEO, like, hey, you might want to say something, but really right now, the best person is someone who's not affiliated. How do you do that strategically? I guess is what I'm asking in terms of, thinking through how to communicate to the CEO under certain circumstances. That's more what I'm
I'm
looking
sure
at.
Lainie has a ton of these examples, but like working in pharma, but like, a lot of times, like in our world, it's like advising the CEO, like, you could take a position on this legislation, you could speak publicly, like, it just looks like I mean, it's pretty obvious the reason you're doing this is because it's going to affect the bottom line, or it's going to like, you're going to be against this because it's more regulation. Like, this is probably best coming from like your trade association. Like, have the trade association like do the dirty work here, or be the one that like is the attack dog. Like, you want like your patients, your customers, like your whoever it is to like probably hear a little bit of a different message, or just stay out of the fray. I mean, we counsel a lot of companies too, like again in the healthcare space, but in other, like sometimes it's having a doctor or a physician. If it's like a really complex health matter, like somebody with a white coat is just going to be a much better messenger than a CEO that is not a doctor or who has a business degree. It really depends on the situation, I think, but I think a lot, I mean, we've done a lot of work in exactly that. Like sometimes if it's like some contentious legislation or something that you don't necessarily, I mean, people know indirectly you're probably against, it's much better sometimes to have like your trade association or a third party, like be the ones to be the bad guy, or to be the one that's taking sort of the tip of the spear on maybe delivering a tough message.
I couldn't agree more. It also enables your company to stay focused on your business and what you need to do, right?
Yeah.
And Erin's absolutely right. In the pharma industry, we really lean in heavily in pharma, which is one of our trade associations, bio, which is another trade association, and others to help communicate some of those, to really like be able to pull the information together across the different pharmaceutical companies and determine, sort of what's best for the industry overall, and then really help like push that message forward. So I think those types of organizations are very critical across all spectrums of healthcare. I mean, I think about the ones within the pharma industry, but and within other industries as well. They have those exist for a reason, and they're so valuable for a reason.
No, it's a good point. When I worked on the Hill, of course, every year I worked for a Texas member. So every year we had to go to the beef industries, big gala event where you all had to eat them food. It was great. I like free food, especially when I was 25. But it was definitely, I didn't realize, of course, back then how the trade association is doing a lot of that relationship building so that individual CEOs don't have to be the ones showing up all the time and building the relationship and trying to make sure we, grease the skids. Makes a lot of sense. So I unfortunately have to jump for another call. So this was great. Lainie, second time we've met. Erin, Alex, thanks for coming on the show again. Really appreciate it. And hope you all enjoy the rest of your weekend. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.